Good afternoon. I'm Omair Ahmad from The Wire, and today I'm discussing Democrats and Dissenters. This is the latest book by one of our preeminent intellectuals, Ramachandra Guha, and a collection of essays on various aspects of Indian democracy. It's probably the best follow-on your India after Gandhi. And some of these essays have been published before today. Now they're been compiled into a book form by Penguin. And thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
So let me begin with an interesting question, which is, it's been 70 years almost of the Indian experiment. And in a way, this experiment can only be, let's say, logically compared with large experiments like the Chinese government and the European Union. How do you compare India to anything?
I think because of the size and the diversity, the four places you could compare it to are, in terms of size, China. In terms of diversity, United States.
Okay.
In terms of scale, also perhaps the USSR, which is of course failed, which was ran for 70 odd years and then failed. But I think India has combined several things that make it unique. It's a combination of size, diversity, democracy, which China and the Soviet Union do not have, and an affirmation of diversity. Unlike the United States, where diversity is there within the population, but it's sort of be flattened out or homogenized by allegiance to what's called an American creed. For example, English is the national language.
Yes.
Christianity is not the official state religion, but sort of Americans think they're a kind of Christian nation, largely. And
in God we trust.
In God we trust. And when George W. Bush said, "Who is your favorite philosopher?" he was asked a question. He said, "Jesus Christ was his favorite philosopher." Now, India has successfully maintained democracy, has successfully maintained largely linguistic diversity. In my view, that's actually our greatest achievement, underappreciated. Okay. That language is fundamental to human identity. More than religion, more than caste. Right? And what India did, partly because of Gandhi's inspiration, was to say that we will not make one single language for the whole nation, unlike Pakistan, where Urdu was imposed on East Pakistan, which led to the split. Unlike Sri Lanka, where Sinhala was opposed to the Tamils, was imposed on the Tamil, leading to a large-scale civil war. So I think our sustenance of linguistic diversity is our greatest achievement. Religious diversity is more problematic. I mean, there's a tension between, are we a Hindu majoritarian state? In theory, we are not. Our constitution makes it very clear. But in practice, over the years, not just under the current regime, but also other regimes, also public life may have unfortunately assumed an explicitly Hindu caste, which in my view is not just mistaken but dangerous. But it has. I mean, if you look at, we take the whole issue of cow slaughter, where the Congress is sometimes even more eager than the BJP to make this an article of their policy, which leads to insecurities among minorities and so on. But anyway, the point is, if you combine scale, diversity and democracy, we are more or less unique.
Okay.
And because the European Union combines scale, diversity and democracy, because there are many countries, many languages, but it's effectively many nations also. I mean, it's kind of a single
Britain
market.
Has proved that.
Britain has proved that. Exactly, Britain has proved that. So, which is what makes the Indian experiment so interesting to study as a scholar, because of this combination of size, diversity, democracy, and with all its flaws, its achievements, its complexities. And I hope what I've tried to do both in India after Gandhi and in this book, Democrats and Dissenters, is not to shirk or suppress the flaws and the ugliness, but at the same time recognize that there is something quite admirable about at least the attempt, even if the attempt is only partially successful. To try and combine scale and diversity and democracy is unprecedented in human history. And to that extent, what Gandhi and Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel and people like that were doing was something special.
Okay. I mean, in a sense, you could argue that the argument between Gandhi and Jinnah, in one sense, especially on minority rights, became something on Jinnah saying that you need legal controls whether it's autonomy or independence or
Yeah.
looking at a very legalistic thing, where Gandhi argued that unless you have wholesale social change, your legal strictures count for nothing.
Yeah.
Looking at minority rights in Pakistan in particular, but also in India to a certain degree, you could say that both were right and both failed. I mean, in different ways. In India, technically, you have much more robust institutions of law, but also you had some effects of social change pushed through by Gandhi. And in fact, I was listening to this radio on program on my way here in my car, which was talking about people giving away flats to couples that have chosen mohabbat or mazhab.
Okay.
And this is done by Investors Clinic or somebody.
I
just heard it on the radio, which I thought was very interesting. That these are people who have left their have had to leave their household. There was one issue of this girl from powerful Goan family who was kidnapped back by her family, and her husband or fiance was threatened. But nevertheless, I mean, there are pushes and strains. But in a sense, that question of India, of protecting individual rights at the end of the day, forget it whether it's marked as religious or not, is still deeply much a work in progress.
Of course. I think Indian democracy is a work in progress. Indian unity is a work in progress. If you look at what's happening in Kashmir today, or if you look at the troubled situation in Manipur, so it is relatively new as a political experiment. I mean, we may say India is an ancient civilization, but it's a new nation and a new political experiment. And because, again, I think it's important to recognize that in some areas there is progress towards greater freedom, towards greater individual rights. In some areas there's a backlash. Okay, freedom of expression is one area, I argue, in which there are more curbs. But if you look at young women today in the cities, have far greater freedoms to choose their romantic partner than they did 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, which is also a marker of freedom very much. I mean, who do you want to spend your life with? I mean, someone your father chose for you or someone you choose, right? Now, so these are ways in which India, so I think, because again, I think the way to understand India and all this complexity is not to see it as unilinear. We're not either desperately falling back. People, what unfortunately some people try to do is, they look at one isolated incident, which is depressing or dark, and they say we're going down the tube. Or they look at some other isolated incident, for example, the software revolution, and say India is going to become a superpower. So I think my own view is much more nuanced and much more complex, and which is why I have called India 50-50 democracy. It is a work in progress, and we could slip to becoming 40-60, or improve to becoming 60-40. I don't think we'll slip too much. I think in India always there is regression in some areas, some spheres, and progress in some areas and some spheres.
So there's one area which I want to talk specifically on, especially because of your own environmental work, is on tribal rights. Because if there is a community that seems to have suffered the most while India has progressed overall, it seems to be the tribal communities whose languages, arts, lands, ways of living have all been marginalized to the extent that we don't see them. And if the Gond tribals are approximately 10 million, that's population of Norway and Sweden. And if we cannot guarantee rights for such a large sector of people, then there's a problem.
Absolutely. I think that's why I wanted to write a special essay on Adivasis, because our treatment of Adivasis is unquestionably a blot on Indian democracy. I say that they've gained least and lost most from 7 decades of economic growth and democracy in India. So they have lost most from economic growth because huge numbers of them have been displaced. Although tribals are 8% of India's population, they're 40% of those that have been displaced by dams, by steel mills. Tribals were displaced in the heyday of Nehruvian socialism by public sector steel plants and dams. They're displaced in the heyday of private sector liberalization, particularly by mining projects. And there's a great deal of conflict. I mean, so they're economically dispossessed. They're also politically disenfranchised. So unlike the Dalits, who continue to be economically dispossessed, or unlike the Muslims who also continue to be economically marginal, relatively, Muslims and Dalits have a presence in national politics. They have been major politicians, ministers, chief ministers, home ministers, governors, presidents who've been chief justices who've been Muslims and Dalits. And the major national parties at least pay token attention to it. Maybe it's not substantive attention, but they talk about it. They recognize, and there's a reason for this. And one of the reasons is geographical. That Muslims and Dalits are spread across all over India. So, in let's say 300 to 350 of the 542 Lok Sabha constituencies, the Muslim vote and the Dalit vote matters.
Okay.
Tribals are geographically concentrated in a few upland, hilly districts in central and northeastern India. So at most they can have an impact on 50 or 60 parliamentary constituencies. This may be the reason that apart from being economically dispossessed, Omair, they are politically disenfranchised. They don't have a voice in the constitutional democratic political system. And that has opened up a vacuum for the Maoists to move in. And the Maoists are very active in tribal areas, and of course they provide no long-term solution for the tribals either. So you have economic dispossession, you have political disenfranchisement, and you also have what you talked about is cultural condescension. So their own rich traditions of art, poetry, music are lost, or not safeguarded.
And crafts.
Yeah, crafts. That's it. So in all these respects, they have been, to use a colloquial word, shafted. And they have suffered partly because of where they are located. They have suffered what I call a triple resource curse. So first their forests, then their waters, then their minerals were taken away from them, and they were dispossessed. It so happened that tribals were a blind spot in the national movement. Gandhi talked about gender equality. He talked about the abolition of untouchability. He gave his life for Hindu-Muslim harmony. But there's virtually nothing in the 90 volumes of his collected works on the Adivasi predicament. And you don't have to blame it. He didn't have to take up everything. Right. On the other side, the Dalits had Ambedkar, who 60 years after his death is still an inspirational figure because of what he did. He provides a role model and an example. So the tribals were neglected by the national movement. They never had a major leader. They have been economically subject to this triple resource curse. They haven't found a voice in politics. And so there are multiple tragedies occurring in tribal India, and arguably they're getting worse.
In one sense, one of the problems with the tribal issues is that these were also linked into India's legal framework, into the policing regulations of the British Raj, the notified tribes, who were classified as criminal tribes, and then post-independence they were denotified. But just a few weeks ago, Kiran Bedi talked about denotified tribes as being criminals, and you look at this mindset, which has not changed from the times of the Raj, and the most powerful people in the country.
No, the example you point to, it was deeply distressing.
It's just horrible.
That a powerful policewoman who's been widely admired for her social work should have such extraordinary prejudice about tribals. It was. So it is a blot on Indian democracy, and it's a blot that is not discussed. I want to write, or not discussed adequately. Specialists know about it, anthropologists know about it, activists know about it, but in the way in which the public discourse of India, the media discourse, the political discourse, parliament, there is talk about Kashmir, there is talk about Nagaland, there is talk about atrocities on Dalits, there is talks or attacks on women, but Adivasis and their predicament rarely figure to the same extent, even though they are arguably worse off.
You hear Salva Judam, and that's about it. There's a linkage I wanted to make with one other article. Which is where you talk about the rights of freedom of expression. And you begin with the fact that some of the problems are ingested or created or inherited from colonial law or new Indian lawmaking, and that our legal framework needs something. What would that something be?
I would say rethinking. I'm not an expert or a jurist. I pointed to some of the sociological and political implications of those archaic laws. It's up to legal specialists to think of ways of rectifying it. But that is certainly true. That the law of sedition, under which Gandhi and Tilak were both tried and sent to jail.
Yes.
Yeah, some of our greatest freedom fighters. And incidentally, a fact that should be more widely known is that when Tilak was tried for sedition, the lawyer who defended him was Jinnah. The lawyer who defended him against the British was Jinnah. Anyway, these are the... and Gandhi said, in 1929, he wrote an article in Young India, in his magazine Young India, where he said, when we get Swaraj, the first thing that should go is the law of sedition. Should be dispensed with. Now it's been 70 years. The British have dispensed with it. It was originally British law. There's no, you can say whatever you want about the Queen. You can mock her, make a satirical film on her, draw cartoons, or about the Prime Minister, and you won't be hauled up for sedition. And I think these are things that are used, in a malign way by our present-day politicians. And across parties. I mean, it happened recently in Karnataka with an actor, Ramya, who said, I went to Pakistan and they were good hosts. She didn't say all Pakistanis are wonderful. She said Pakistan is not hell because her defense. There was a case against the law of sedition. And what happens is when you have an archaic law, you have some publicity-seeking judge who's willing to entertain a frivolous petition. So there's a judge in Coorg who accepted a petition against Ramya. So Ramya is now burdened with this case that she'll have to fight for the next 10 years. I mean, it is absurd.
I recently reviewed a book for The Wire, Robert Lacey's Inside the Kingdom. And this is on Saudi Arabia, and he spent 30 years inside, so it's quite interesting. But one of the insights that comes from that is that the law has always been handed over to the clerics. And that has ingested into society a way of thinking that is incredibly close-minded. In a sense, with us, some of the colonial lives in our head because the law is the greatest act of speech in a democracy, and that law keeps recurring, and it's the British Raj, frankly, one of our ways maybe, and I'd like your opinion on this, is the way we tend to deal with dissent, whether it's Iram Sharmila or Kashmir or protests in Chhattisgarh and others, seems more derivative of the British Raj than anything from Gandhian or
absolutely.
thinking.
Though I would still like to make a distinction between what is happening with Iram Sharmila and freedom of expression one side, and in Kashmir and Chhattisgarh on the other. In that, Iram Sharmila is non-violent. When Ramya says, my Pakistanis who hosted me were nice people, she's, just normal behavior.
Yes.
So that, whereas in Kashmir and in Chhattisgarh, though the law of sedition has been misused and abused, the fact is that there are armed insurgencies against the government.
Sure.
So I think, but when a government, a democratic government, uses the law of sedition to choke someone who is not preaching violence or disaffection, but merely expressing an opinion, I think that there's something dangerously wrong with our society.
And actually, I was thinking more about our social reaction
versus
our government's reaction. Because a government is somebody we elect, but it's much more important what society elects them. And it seems that our society is also very comfortable with repressive acts.
I think we are very insecure about our nationalism. And we don't need to be. I mean, I don't think India is going to fall apart at the seams. It's not going to balkanize in many parts. Someone in Manipur says, get rid of AFSPA. It doesn't mean that Manipur is going to become an independent country tomorrow. We have many of our nationalists, so-called nationalists and jingoists, are actually fearful and insecure about their nationalism. I mean, a secure nationalist who is comfortable with what India should mean would not worry if someone criticized India. I mean, which is why the epigraph to my book is, every sensitive nationalist must have a sense of shame about the crimes committed by his state in the name of nationalism. Of course, as a nationalist, I'm appalled by how India treats the Adivasis. By discriminating against women. The fact that Iram Sharmila has been force-fed for more than a decade, I think should shame us. I mean, the excessive use of force in Kashmir, the pellet guns, should shame us. I mean, every nationalist must be ashamed at the crimes committed in the name of his nation, by his state. I mean, that is, in my view, but that you must defend your country, whatever happens, and you must defend your state, whatever happens, whatever crime. I think that is not the kind of nationalism that certainly someone like Gandhi or Ambedkar or Nehru Wellington. I mean, they didn't have this hard. I mean, certainly not Ambedkar, certainly not Gandhi. Maybe Patel. I'm not sure. Maybe Patel was a hard state man. Though, I mean, he didn't really talk about Indian deficiencies. Nehru was always talking about the weaknesses of our society. You know, he was appalled by our treatment of women. Ambedkar was appalled by our treatment of Dalits. And you know, Gandhi would also have been appalled by many things happening in India today. I mean, there's a joke I'd like to tell, which is told by Shiv Vishwanathan, the sociologist. You know, there's a famous line of Gandhi, which you know, where when he went to England in 1931 for the Round Table Conference, he was asked by a journalist, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he answered, I think it would be a good idea. And Shiv Vishwanathan says, as a footnote to that, if Gandhi was reborn and he came to India, and a journalist, shall we say, from Times Now, so let's asked him, Mahatma Ji, what do you think of Indian civilization? He would reply, that too would be a good idea. All right. No, so I think if Gandhi was to come back today, he would be ashamed of some of the things that are done in the name of the nation he helped create. And every true nationalist must have a sense of shame at the crimes committed by state. I mean, when it comes to our treatment of the Adivasis, there is no question that we have betrayed 18 million Indians.
There was this fascinating exchange that you've narrated here between Narayan and Nehru about democracy, its faults, parliamentary democracy in India, and you talk about how it's about its relevance in today. But you know, there's one interesting thing. When I was in the UK, and I worked briefly with the Conservatives when they were in opposition, I found it very interesting that they had a shadow cabinet. Where one person responded to one person. India has never inherited that kind of structured opposition and hasn't, whether in the center and in the states even less so. So the idea of parliament as a house of debate has declined, and after the anti-defection law has pretty much vanished.
Absolutely. And the anti-defection law has had some very pernicious effects, including in the state assemblies. And that's true. I mean, it's a theatre for debate and discussion. Parliament was very active. I mean, when I wrote India After Gandhi, I had to study the debates of the 50s on the Hindu personal law bill, of the 60s on the Chinese debacle and the first no confidence motion brought against the Nehru government. Very rich debates up to the time of the Bangladesh war, and then it all declined. I mean, then the party whip, anti-defection law, all changed, and of course, state assemblies don't debate these things at all. And you're absolutely right that we don't have a structured opposition. And one of the reasons we don't have a structured opposition is also because political parties are centralized in individuals. So, and the BJP is also going down this way. BJP prided itself for so long on being opposed to Vyakti Puja, but with the puja of Narendra Modi most recently on his birthday yesterday or day before, exceeded any worship of Jawaharlal Nehru or Indira Gandhi in their prime. And I think most of Sonia Gandhi is the opposition. She does not want to designate a shadow cabinet because her point of view is, I will retain the privilege when I come back to power to appoint whoever I favor as education minister. But that is a very short-sighted view. They should be training people from now. So if there is a shadow education minister who for 3 years is continuously interrogating the ruling government, that person has an understanding of that sector, so that if once they come to power, they can act on it. So that's a very good system. I think that whole shadow cabinet system, I think, is an excellent system.
Unfortunately, not one we have. One last question before I let you go, which is the one issue that you touch on when it comes to international politics is on China. And it's interesting because India, China, we talk about us as neighbors. I was just in Nangla, and so near the Bhakra Dam, they have this little cabinet where they say this is where the Panchil principles were first discussed in 1954 and all of that. But we have very little understanding of China, and they have less of us.
Probably,
but they are our most important neighbor. How does one think through China?
So I think more interaction, more travel, more tourism, I think is very important. I think we did have it historically. I mean, civilizationally, we had a long encounter with China through the travelers, through the Buddhists. That went, and there was a period in the 80s and 90s where if you were a Communist Party of India, Marxist intellectual, you could go to China. Otherwise, you couldn't go to China. Now, I think that is changing. I had a very interesting time in China. I recognized that it's a much more complex society than as portrayed in the Indian press. It is authoritarian. The party has an iron grip, but there's a great deal of debate and discussion among intellectuals. There's a sense that the Han majoritarianism has to give way to a greater appreciation of Tibetan and Uyghur and other cultures, and and I think the more we travel and the more they travel, you're right. I mean, the Chinese are now inveterate tourists. Under Mao they were closed in; they couldn't go out. But now, because of economic growth, they at least have the freedom to travel. They don't have the freedom to criticize their own government within, but they have the freedom to travel. But they go to Japan, they go to Egypt, they don't come here. I think our so-called incredible India tourism thing should be directed much more to China. I think Indians are going to China. I mean, a friend yesterday, her father has celebrated his birthday, 90th birthday. She's taking him to China.
Oh wow!
Which would not have happened 10 years ago. No chance. No chance. Now there's much more trade. I think some of our IT companies have set up stuff there. Of course, there's export of minerals, which is both good and bad. So there are fairly large trading partners of ours. Some interaction is taking place. I think it is Indians have been obsessed with Pakistan, and they've demonized China, but they've never sought to engage with China. I mean, with Pakistan is the intense love and a love-hate relationship, right? But I think China is a fascinating place, complex place, and I think beyond the political engagement, the everyday encounters of citizens, I think, are very important.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Guha, for that really interesting, also wide-ranging discussion. And for people who wish to get a little more into it, this is the book. Go and buy it. Thank you.